And I want to share with you PFC Manning's statement that's part of this request. And so I'll read it to you. The decisions that I made in 2010 were made out of a concern for my country and the world that we live in. Since the tragic events of 9/11, our country has been at war. We have been at war with an enemy that chooses not to meet us on a traditional battlefield. And due to this fact, we've had to alter our methods of combating the risks posed to us in our way of life. I initially agreed with these methods and chose to volunteer to help defend my country. It was not until I was in Iraq and reading secret military reports on a daily basis that I started to question the morality of what we were doing. It was at this time I realized that our efforts to meet the risks posed to us by the enemy, we have forgotten our humanity. We consciously elected to devalue human life both in Iraq and Afghanistan. When we engage those that we perceive were the enemy, we sometimes killed innocent civilians. Whenever we killed innocent civilians, instead of accepting responsibility for our conduct, we elected to hide behind the veil of national security and classified information in order to avoid any public accountability. In our zeal to kill the enemy, we eternally debated the definition of torture. We held individuals at Guantanamo for years without due process. We inexplicably turned a blind eye to torture and executions by the Iraqi government. And we stomached countless other acts in the name of our war on terror. Patriotism is often the cry extolled when morally questionable acts are advocated by those in power. When these cries of patriotism drown out any logically based dissension, it is usually the American soldier that is given the order to carry out some ill-conceived mission. Our nation has had similar dark moments for the virtues of democracy. The Trail of Tears, the Dred Scott decision, McCarthyism, and the Japanese-American internment camps, to mention a few. I am confident that many of the actions since 9/11 will one day be viewed in a similar light. As the late Howard Zinn once said, there is not a flag large enough to cover the shame of killing innocent people.
Hear, hear.
I understand that my actions violated the law. I regret if my actions hurt anyone or harmed the United States. It was never my intent to hurt anyone. I only wanted to help people. When I chose to disclose classified information, I did so out of a love for my country and a sense of duty to others. If you deny my request for a pardon, I will serve my time knowing that sometimes you have to pay a heavy price to live in a free society. I will gladly pay that price if it means we could have a country that is truly conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all, and he puts in here women and men, are created equal. Now, the family of Bradley Manning has asked me to read the following statement. We are saddened and disappointed in today's sentence. We continue to believe that Brad's intentions were good and that he believed he was acting in the best interest of this country. We will again like to thank his extraordinary defense team for their tireless efforts on his behalf. And of course, we want to thank Courage to Resist, the Bradley Manning Support Network, and the thousands of supporters around the world who have stood with Brad throughout this ordeal. Please know that his fight is not over. And actually, I couldn't have ended that better, because his fight is not over. My representation of him at a court-martial may end, but my representation of him and ensuring that he one day, and one day very soon, walks out of Fort Leavenworth has just begun. And with that, I will gladly answer any questions, and I know there might be a few, so raise your hand, I'll point out to you, and I'll ask the question.
What would you see is at stake here?
I think what's at stake here is how do we as a public want to be informed about what our government does? The national security apparatus in this country has exploded since 9/11. And you don't even understand how much money gets put into national security defense because that itself is secret. So I think what's at stake here is how do we want to live as a country? And what do we want to say that we will do as a country in our self-defense? And what do we want to not do? And it's important, that last part, what do we not want to do? Because that's what makes us different from the enemy that we are facing. We don't torture. We don't hold people for years without due process. We don't target for assassination innocent American people. We don't do that as a country. So I think what's at stake is what history will say to us, how we acted. And we haven't learned that. As Bradley pointed out, the Japanese American internment camps, McCarthyism, just to name a few things in our past, not so distant past, where we should be ashamed of how we treated a sector of our public for no other reason than they now were somehow targeted as a potential enemy.
Senator Bowman, you're on news. What are going to be your next steps, your next actions as his legal representative?
Well, to get attention to what's happened here, I will be submitting post-trial matters for him to the convening authority, and that is a time in which his sentence could be reduced. The convening authority has the power to do that. After that, then I will represent him for future parole and clemency issues. Hopefully the president does the right thing, and those are ruled out as options because he pardons or he releases them with time to serve.
Raf Sanchez from the Daily Telegraph. In the statement that you just read out, Private Manning said that he did what he did out of concern for his country and out of patriotism, but he also said he was sorry for hurting the United States. And I'm just wondering, does he stand by his actions, or are there things now that he would have done differently? Does he have regrets?
Well, obviously, in everything you do in life, hindsight's 20/20. What I can tell you about Bradley Manning is he's a very moral person, and that morality has been with him from the beginning. I believe that when he went there, and you can see this from his conversations with Lauren McNamara, his chat conversations that were admitted into evidence, he went there with the goal of hopefully saving lives. He went there with the goal of helping his command ensure that every soldier, every contractor got home safely, and even the local nationals got home safely. I think he would still be troubled, and was troubled by what he saw. I certainly believe that because of his strong sense of morality, he would do the same thing. Yes.
Can I follow up on that? You also mentioned in your opening that he believes he believes that he released the information because it would spark a debate, it would potentially spark some sort of reform. I mean, at this point, putting all the court-martial aside, all the judicial side, does he believe that the information he released sparked a debate or any kind of reform? And then again, if I can just ask you a technical question, I think a lot of the reporters are confused about when exactly he will be eligible for parole, specifically under today's, assuming there's no difference in the appeal or whatnot, when he's eligible for parole.
Okay. So the Apache helicopter video sparked a debate. You didn't have to be a person who was for or against the war to see that something was wrong with that video. The SIGACs, the Significant Activity Reports, I think those are historically very significant because it shows the extent of innocent civilian deaths that were underreported. It also shows what we ask our men and women, our very brave men and women in uniform to do on a daily basis, every day, in a combat environment. The diplomatic cables certainly spark debate because in America we have the luxury of believing that we always do the right thing. We are the good guys. We're the white hats. We do things because it's the right thing to do, not because it's just in our interest. That's what a lot of people believe. You can't read the cables and come away with that belief. You see that we sometimes make bad decisions because it's in our national interest and not necessarily in the interest of citizens as a whole. We ought to expect more of a country than that. We should expect that sometimes we'd make a deal or take a position that's not to our advantage because it's the right thing to do. And with regards to the sentence, if nothing happens and he has a 35-year sentence, under military rules, after 10 years, he would be eligible for parole. And he would go in front of a parole and clemency board at the 10-year mark. If he's denied parole that first time, he's reviewed every year thereafter. I personally have never done a parole and clemency board, but I will be the smartest person 7 years from now on everything involving parole and clemency.
So that 10 years includes his time served, or I'm sorry, the 1,294 days.
Right, so he gets credit for that, so he's got another 7 years before his first look. Now, I'll go on this side, and I'll come back over.
If you were advising Edward Snowden now, would you suggest that he came home to the United States to face trial?
Well, you know, if he were my client at this point, I would tell him that the current environment is not one that's friendly to whistleblowers, certainly. We certainly should have a discussion on what are appropriate leaks and what steps you should go to get this information out. But you look at Thomas Drake, for example. He's a prime example of a whistleblower who tried to take every step that you would expect a whistleblower to take prior to giving it to a journalist. And it didn't lead him to anywhere. So instead of signing whistleblower protections, we need to actually get something where a whistleblower can go to a journalist or group of journalists who are not subjected to the government, and they can make a determination. Is this the type of information that the American public needs to know? Or does it truly pose a danger to national security? One more on this side.